Well, hello all and welcome back to the PIP Cottage. I trust all has been well. It's been a little spell since I've had a film on here, at least one that had something that I hope is somewhat important to talk about. At least it's going to be fun for me to talk about. Sporting a corn cob today with some Lane BCA aromatic. There's something about a corn cob and an aromatic that just goes together like peas and carrots. Like Fred and Ginger. Like Lester and Earl. When you can get it to going good. Yeah. Boy, that gets the job done right there. All right, I want to talk to you for a few moments today about some books regarding the history of tobacco, primarily the history of tobacco in the United States. And when I say the United States, I of course mean the American South. There was some tobacco grown up north in various places. You can grow tobacco in many different parts of America, but the fact remains that the American South is where the bulk of the history has been located. So, I got 3 books that I want to tell you about. The first, which you may or may not know of, is Tobacco Culture. A book written by the historian T.H. Breen in the 1980s. Now, this was common fare in graduate school. And I was going to graduate school at Mississippi State. We had to read this book. And I really enjoyed it. Tobacco Culture, the mentality of the great Tidewater planters on the eve of the Revolution. It's really a story about colonial Virginia. And I don't think you can understand colonial Virginia without understanding tobacco agriculture. I'll just read a little piece of the dust jacket for you to give you a little idea of what's going on. This study focuses on how wealthy tobacco planters gave meaning to existence, sorting out in the fields and marketplaces the highly personal, value-laden relationships that led from tobacco to politics, from agrarian experience to political protest. Oh, this is good. This is more than a history about the culture of tobacco production in the colonial era. It's a study of how tobacco is at the absolute center of the future that people in Virginia have on the eve of the Revolution. There's an excellent quote in here that I wanted to share with you about Virginia, if I can find it. Yes. Here, I'll read this to you. This is next to chapter 1 in the book. So it's actually a quote from Walker Percy in Walker Percy's Lancelot. Virginia, yes, don't you see? Virginia is where it will begin. And it is where there are men who will do it. Just as it was Virginia where it all began in the beginning, or at least where the men were to conceive it. The Great Revolution fought, won it, and saw it on its way. They began the Second Revolution, and we lost it. Perhaps the Third Revolution will end differently. It won't be California after all. It will be settled in Virginia, where it started. Virginia. Walker Percy, Lancelot. Oh, that's a mighty fine statement. And of course, by the Second Revolution, we understand that Percy is quoting Stonewall Jackson, our Second American Revolution, the Civil War and the South's attempt to preserve its independence from the federal union. A couple of additional quotes for you to kind of whet your appetite. This is in our PIP Cottage book club. This is a book that I was going to use, but I didn't because it's hard to buy on a large scale. I wasn't sure that we could find enough of copies to make it work for the people who signed up in the book club. So I didn't use it there, but I wanted to share it with you here. So this is again T.H. Breen in the introduction, the preface actually. The book explores the construction of a specific social reality. By understanding these mental processes, we learn how these men perceived agricultural and economic changes over which they exercised little control, and more, why on the eve of the American Revolution, many great tidewater planters championed a radical political ideology. And one of the most important things that she's talking about here, and this was a significant piece of American historiography in the 1980s, this idea of country republicanism. This notion which ultimately builds into the idea of it becomes a main idea in the founding generation, this idea that agriculture is at the basis of a civilized society. And America at that time, and well up until after the Second World War, the American South remained primarily an agricultural civilization. But it's more than simply talking about plows and disc harrows and draft horses and when to plant and when to harvest. This agrarian ideology, this agrarianism actually that T.H. Breen was trying to speak about 40 years ago, and which has been developed in the historiography much better since then, actually. This agrarian ideology was at the very heart of what it meant to be an American in the 18th century. And so, even though the book is about tobacco, it's about far, far more than that. It's about the American Revolution. It's about Southern distinctiveness, Southern identity, and why Virginia particularly is so important if we are to properly understand the period of colonization and settlement in North America. Now, the second book that I want to tell you about, which I think I mentioned probably 2 or 3 years ago before we moved to Kentucky. Actually, I vaguely remember mentioning this book in the little study I used to have behind our house in South Carolina. Drew Swanson's A Golden Weed. Now, this book it's not very old at all. I think it's, let's see, 2014. Published by the University of Georgia Press. No, excuse me, published by Yale University Press. I was thinking about the University of Georgia's Southern Environmental History series, but this is different. This is Yale University Press. And Yale University Press, for those of you who are interested, also has a pretty extensive list of publications about the agricultural history of the United States. And so if that's something that you're interested in, look up the Yale Agrarian series. Now, this I just the first paragraph of the preface, again, to just whet your appetite a little bit regarding this book from Drew Swanson. The farmer holds a rather schizophrenic place in American history, serving as both hero and villain at various points. On one hand, our histories portray farmers as sources of boundless energy and enterprise, pushing the nation westward, driving economic growth, fueling an almost limitless productivity, and expounding upon the American dream. On the other hand, the farmer often plays the part of historical anchor, a rather greedy dullard who exploits both land and labor in a never-ending pursuit of profit. The farmer is old-fashioned, conservative, opposed to genuine reform or progress, and especially fearful of cities and industry. Rather than making a living in cooperation with the land, this farmer abuses landscapes and then moves on to fresh ones, driving national expansion through carelessness and waste rather than industriousness. Recall your American History Survey. Tobacco growers appear first as get-rich-quick schemers in Jamestown, Virginia. So tobacco crazed that they plant the weed in the streets and fail to raise corn for their own larders. They reappear as aristocratic Chesapeake planters, abusing their slave labor even as they demand independence from Britain. And then he goes on into a larger discussion of just how important tobacco cultivation is for our understanding of the American past. He says this book is part of a growing body of literature on the environmental history of the American South. In the following pages, this is a history looking from the tobacco field outward, exploring farmers' view of the world. It's an effort to take their claims and their environmental understandings as seriously as they did, and to recover a world that has been all but lost. In this attempt, we find a new history of 19th century Southern agriculture. No less tragic for its fresh details, but important nonetheless if we wish to understand how the modern world came to be. And so this is not a book about Virginia. This is a book about the Piedmont of North Carolina more than anything else. He does talk about South Carolina very vaguely and briefly, but mostly this is a history that concentrates on, I think, the part of the country where Drew Swanson is native to, where he's from, the Piedmont area of North Carolina. So if you're interested in a more recent history of tobacco production in the American South, check out Drew Swanson's A Golden Weed, Tobacco and Environment in the Piedmont South. Now, I personally didn't come along soon enough to be involved with any actual tobacco farming when I was coming up in South Carolina. My grandfather was from the PD area of South Carolina originally, and he was farming tobacco in the 1940s and 1950s. Just like many other people who were trying to make a living in the years surrounding the Second World War in that part of the world. Now, the final book that I want to tell you about is actually a primary historical document, if you ask me. It's published in the 1940s, and it's entitled The Production of Tobacco. The Production of Tobacco. I picked this book up for $10 at a used bookstore a couple of years ago. The Production of Tobacco, and it is written by Whiteman Garner, who worked for the USDA during that point in time. Can you imagine the USDA today producing a book that essentially celebrates tobacco production? I don't think so. 1946, published by the Country Life Press Corps, Garden City, New York, 1946. And this is an interesting book. Not only, let me put this pipe down just a minute. Not only, and why do I call it a primary source? Well, I call it a primary source because it gives us a detailed analysis of how the USDA and how tobacco farmers were thinking about the science and the horticulture surrounding the tobacco plant and tobacco cultivation in the 1940s, which is in many ways the heyday of pipe smoking in the United States. Chapter 1, the tobacco plant and its product. Chapter 2, history of the tobacco industry. The part 2 of the book explains to you how to grow, cure, and market the crop in 1940s America. Fertilization of the crop. Production cost and profits. And he even has an excellent discussion about tobacco production in other lands and other places around the world in the 1940s. Many tobaccos that we cannot get anymore for pipe tobacco. There's an excellent conversation in here about the history of Latakia and the history of the wonderful Oriental tobaccos that we no longer have in many of our prized blends. But anyway, there's just so much information in here. You've got graphs, and it's really more of a scientific treatise, but it's endlessly fascinating if you want to know more about tobacco soil, about how tobacco is grown in America and how that compares to other countries during that time period. the photographs are just wonderful photographs. Method of constructing bulks for fermentation of shade-grown cigar wrapper leaf. And let me see if I can get that in there to you, where you can see that photograph. See, there's wonderful photographs all throughout, and just $10. Nobody cares about this sort of material anymore. And I don't know how you could find the book, but what I'm just saying to you, let's see, cigars. He's got oh, I love this. He's got a section here on page 475 towards the end of the book about smoking tobaccos. He's characterizing tobaccos as smoking tobaccos, as cigars, cigarettes, chewing tobacco. Quite an array of products is included in the category of smoking tobaccos, but many of these products differ only in amount of detail. Granulated tobacco. It consists essentially of leaf broken into flakes, neither too large nor too small, with flavoring added and packing mostly in small cotton bags. Oh, can you imagine? Burley also is extensively used, and various blends are made with it. Ooh, let's see. Plug cut, sometimes called cut plug in its various modifications, also is an important form of smoking tobacco. An English form of plug cut known as shag contains a considerable proportion of latakia leaf that is produced in Lebanon and Syria. Of course, that was in the 1940s. And towards the end of the book, he does discuss this question of whether tobacco should be produced more by individuals for personal use rather than produced exclusively as on the industrial model. And one of the reasons that he says more people were not producing tobacco on a more home level, home scale in the mid-20th century America is because of the aging process. You can't just simply grow the tobacco like you would a crop of corn and harvest it and then use it immediately. It requires an aging process to be properly fermented and to properly develop flavors. Well, that's fine, and that's true to a certain extent, but it's still possible. There were still people smoking their own homegrown tobaccos in the 1940s and 50s, and it's still possible now with a little time, patience, and skill. Just like I said in one of my previous videos about the Sutliff debacle, it seems to me that it's perfectly possible for somebody to grow tobacco for home consumption. Well, here on my farm in Kentucky, we have every once in a while, maybe 3 or 4 times a year, I'll notice a helicopter flying across my bottomland. And I wanted to figure out why that was happening. I noticed after living here for close to 3 years now that happens on a fairly regular basis. And I discovered that it is primarily the folks in local government trying to make sure that nobody's got a pot garden anywhere on their property back in the hills. So if we reach the point where we have helicopters flying over our farms to make sure we're not growing patches of tobacco, then, well, we might be dealing with a different issue and we'll have to take care of that. But other than government regulation and government restrictions, I see no reason why people can't grow their own tobacco. Anyway, that's a completely different topic for another time. I wanted to share with you those 3 books. Interesting stuff to read. The Drew Swanson book is probably a bit dense for those who are reading simply for leisure. Tobacco Culture is not a difficult read at all. If you really want a scholarly book that it is 40 years old now, but it's still very scholarly and still quite good. But ladies and gentlemen, this is Alan Harrelson with the PIP Cottage. I've got to go. I'm going to make a couple more videos for the PIP Club today. We're having our first live stream on the PIP Cottage social app, and wanted to remind you of that again. That app is free to anybody who wants to use it. But I'm having fun with the book club, and looking forward to that first live stream tonight. And I've enjoyed talking with you here today. I got to go, but this is Alan Harrelson with the PIP Cottage. Thank you for stopping by.